Hey there, welcome to Blockhead, the Peanuts tribute podcast from a cartoonist's point of view. My name is Geoff Grogan, and I will be your host for the next few minutes to talk about Peanuts, Charles Schulz, and all things Charlie Brown, Linus, Lucy, and Snoopy too. So sit back and enjoy. Hello again, welcome to another edition of Blockhead. Today is a very special day. Have we got an episode lined up for you? Yes, indeed. This is the one I've been talking about for, it seems like months now, but it's only been a few weeks. But I've been anticipating it. I hope you have been too. Today we have a true cartooning legend with us. We have Lynn Johnston of the beloved comic strip For Better or For Worse. To celebrate the 41st anniversary of For Better or For Worse, we sit down with Lynn to talk about her life, her career, For Better or For Worse, how it developed, cartooning in general, Charles Schulz, comics, and everything under the sun that we could think of. We touch base on in this conversation, and it's just terrific. And I have to tell you, Lynn was just so forthcoming and so nice, and it was a real pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to her. I have to say, was just one of the special moments in this podcast for me. So I think you're going to enjoy it. If you're a fan of comics, if you're a fan of comic strips and cartooning over the last 50 or 60 years and you care about comics history, then I know you must be a Lynn Johnston fan. So sit back and get ready. And hey, while you're listening, you might consider heading on over to patreon.com/Geoff Grogan and consider supporting the podcast. If you're a fan of this episode, a fan of this show in general, anything you can contribute to the Patreon page would be a big plus, a big help to ensuring the longevity of the program. There's lots of interesting little giveaways for Patreon supporters on every level, so check it out today, okay? Having done the due diligence to the commercial, let's get right to the interview. Lynn Johnston and myself in conversation. Hello, Lynn Johnston. Welcome to Blockhead.
Hello. Thanks for calling.
Sure. I mean, I'm thrilled to call. I'm absolutely. This is just a big, exciting moment for me to be able to reach out and talk to you, who is one of the greatest cartoonists of the last 50 years. I mean, it's amazing, and it's fun, and it's exciting, and I'm sitting on pins and needles here because I'm so excited to talk to you.
Well, get up. Well,
wow.
You know, it's great to hear you say those lovely things, because anytime I talk to anybody under, say, 30, they have no idea what For Better or For Worse was. They know Peanuts, though.
Well, I guess, but still, For Better or For Worse is still in 2,000 papers or something like that?
About 1,200, I think.
1,200, okay. So,
yeah.
Well, that's just not because the strip is shrinking, but rather because the newspaper business is. And
it is.
The thing, I mean, it's interesting what you mentioned about folks under 30. They just don't read newspapers like we did growing up. And I'm in the ballpark, I'm a baby boomer, late-end baby boomer. So newspapers were a big part of my upbringing and a part of my everyday routine through adulthood up until even today. But I read them online, and it's a changing world out there in terms of how people get their information, and it's impacted the comic strip industry. But For Better or For Worse is still out there and still available, and it's a stellar achievement. And last year was its 40th anniversary, and you had a big retrospective.
Yes. Yes, yeah. And we're very lucky to have a wonderful collection of books coming out through IDW in San Diego. And they do classic comic strips just as they originally appeared in the paper. So everything you see in these fabulous books, there's going to be 9 of them altogether, and they're huge. They're big, thick collections. And they are the original colors, the original size, and it's really a lovely thing to be able to have.
I have seen those books, and although my collections are all, I don't want to date myself, but they're all the older ones, but I have seen those books. They are beautiful. IDW does a wonderful job reproducing your work and reproducing classic comic strips in general. Yeah, it's a golden era for the reprinting of and collecting of classic comic strips.
Well, I'm thrilled that that's the case, because if it wasn't for the people who love the work and collect it and keep it in hermetically sealed files in the Library of Congress and other places, I mean, we don't take care of our work, and for the longest time I had really no record except for what my web designer kept and what my father-in-law kept. He cut everything out and put it in scrapbooks. If it wasn't for the scrapbooks, we would have missed a lot of original art.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. I mean, cartoonists are notorious for not saving their work and or for tossing it aside. And
Well, yeah, when you think about all the drawings and where do you put it?
yeah,
Where
right.
do you put it?
You got to rent a storage container or facility just
Yeah,
to store because it's like 10,000 strips you've drawn, isn't it?
about that, sure.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
unbelievable. 30 years. The strip ran for 30 years in with all new material, correct? From
Yes.
79 to
Yeah.
yeah, so and then it went into reruns. So still 30 years of comic strips. That's unbelievable. 30 years and 365 days a year.
Yeah.
I can't, but I'm not a math whiz, so I can't do the
Well, everybody who does, a daily syndicated comic strip, that's their life. That's what you do. So everybody who's still working, who started when I did, I mean, imagine the drawers and cabinets and
Oh
filing
my
systems.
gosh.
Yeah, plus the online filing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a ton of work that's out there. And it's wonderful. There are institutions now that are trying to collect that material. Here in the U.S., Billy Ireland Museum
Right.
is a great resource for collecting old comic strips and original artwork. And of course, the Schultz Museum has not all of, but a great chunk of Charles Schultz's
Yeah.
work. And
Yeah.
and your original work was just in a retrospective exhibition, I guess that's traveling now, in what was it, the Art Gallery of Sudbury? Was that?
It was in Washington at the Canadian Embassy. It's just being packed up
Oh,
from there and sent back. Yeah.
oh, that's fantastic. So, I didn't realize it had gone to Washington. Oh,
Yeah, it's
wonderful.
there. It's just finished now. It's just being packed up and sent back now.
How did that retrospective come together? How was it that I mean, what was the impetus behind it, and who originated the idea, and how did it all come together?
Well, it usually starts with one enthusiastic person who thinks it's a good idea, and that was somebody at the Sudbury Gallery in Canada, and
Hmm.
it was really a year long project, because you have to write a catalog to go with it and then have merchandise and other stuff, and it was a well received show, and it traveled around Ontario, and then it went out to Eastern Canada, and then just as we were packing it up from there, they requested it down in Washington, which was lovely.
Oh, that's
So
great.
it's down there now, just coming back.
Right. It was original artwork, right? There was a lot of original
some
artwork.
of it some of it was original, and some of it was, there are wonderful copies now,
Oh,
fabulous copies. And so some of the storylines, like the death of Farley and
yeah.
Lawrence's coming out story, they're in different archives. One is in, I think it's San Francisco Museum, and one of them is at the Ohio State, and then
Oh,
some are with the Canadian archives as well. So
I see.
some are not really that available, and it's
Hmm.
much easier to copy it than to try and wrench it from the archives people, who with their gloved hands hold on like tight. They don't want to let anything go.
Yeah, they didn't want to let it go. You said it took about a year to put together. How were you involved in the choices for the material that was going to be in the exhibition and the storylines, or were those pretty obvious, the things that were going to be
We let
focused?
them do the choosing, the people at
Okay.
the Sudbury Gallery, and there were things that they wanted to show. And also, it was a retrospective of work that I did when I was a little kid, and the work that I'm doing now, which is surface designs, fabric designs for any kind of surface. And so, because I don't want to stop working. And so we're working with t-shirt companies and ties and all kinds of other things just for fun,
Uh-huh.
just to get some new patterns, new ideas, new designs out there. So that's what we're messing around with right now. And I paint on this side for fun.
Oh, that's great. And some of that is available to be seen in this wonderful book. I think it's the catalog from the show, or it
Yes,
went with the comic art of Lynn Johnston, which
right.
is available pretty
Yeah.
much anywhere and on Amazon, and if people are interested. And there's a really generous selection of your wonderful fabric designs and your forays into painting and a number of different things that are all brand new. It's all pretty
Pretty
exciting.
sort of new, yeah. Yeah, sort of new.
Yeah.
You have to keep working. You have to keep going, and there's no possible way I could sustain a comic strip now. It's just, it's a it's a huge amount of work. People tend to think, oh, you just do a drawing a day and send it in, but that's
Right.
not the case. They don't accept anything less than a week's worth at a time, and the week's worth has to be good, in order to make it good and well drawn and well thought out. I mean, it does take time, and you really have to work hard at it. It's you're working on planes and in hotel rooms and on holiday weekends, and yeah, it's a lot of work.
It never stops. It's a constant. I mean, I don't want to call it a grind, but it is a constant pressure in order to
Yeah.
create, and that's great creatively. On the one hand, all of that pushing you to create and the constant creation just makes you that much better, and certainly you can see the evolution of your style artistically over the course of 30 years. It changes
Yeah.
dramatically from the beginning.
Everybody's
A-
style changes. I mean, you look at
Absolutely.
anybody's original, Garfield, you look at the original Garfield, he looks nothing like today. And
Hmm.
Charlie Brown, the original Charlie Brown, looks nothing like Charlie Brown today. And we all grow and change, and you can't help that because you want to improve.
Right.
Once you get the job, you're just a fledgling. And once you learn how to handle those pens and you get the right paper, then you just want to get better and better at what you're doing. And it becomes your signature. You know how when you write your signature, it's
Hmm.
never the same twice, but it always identifiable as your signature because of the way you draw it. And so the comic art characters become part of your signature, and it just comes out of your pen the way it comes out. But it takes years of practice to get it to look the way it does when you're at the top of your game.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see comparing the early work that you did and those first strips, and you were trying to get a lot of information into the strips in those early ones, and you got tons of information into the strip in the later ones. And it's really interesting to see the distinction between, how you approached all that information in the early years versus later. Later on, it's so clear that and I love the early style. Absolutely, it's wonderful. But it's interesting to see how in the later style you become so much more of a designer in a way in relationship to the earlier work, which is very intuitive and very free flowing, and the later work is just there's like this understanding of how much is going to be legible in the newspaper, how much is going to be legible when you look at you're looking at an illustration, how much is the reader's going to pick up on it. There's just this enormous amount of control and skill that's evident.
Well, two things. One, when I first started, it was going to be a gag a day, just something, a gag a
Hmm.
day. But that didn't work out because I kept saying to myself, and then what happened? You do a gag and, one person barks at the other, and then you say, but then there's always a comeuppance. If the kid yelled at the mom, well, obviously the mom's going to say that's not acceptable, and you've got another storyline starting. So after about the first 2 years, I started doing storylines, and that changed my writing style. But the other thing that changed my drawing style was hiring another graphic artist to work with me. That was a lifesaver. She was a really talented girl, and she could use the pens that I used. And I drew everything out in pencil, but the only thing I actually inked myself was the characters. I wouldn't let anybody touch those. But she inked everything else and erased the panel, because every time I erase something, I don't know, I get a coffee ring on it or I sneeze, and the ink goes with my eraser, and there you got a big whiteout patch to fix. And I
Yeah.
loved it when Laura would just erase everything for me, and she was very clean and wonderfully talented artist. So that helped immeasurably.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a wonderfully organic line to, and this is cartooning stuff now, but we have a lot of cartoonists who listen to the show. So there's a wonderfully organic line that you have all the way through the strip that's particularly in the figures. And I love that kind of flowing quality that you had. I mean, one of the things that I noticed when the strip first came out, and I was like 18 or 19, I think, when the strip first came out. So I was reading it pretty much early on, and immediately I gravitated to it because it was new visuals on the comics page, but also it was really clear that you love to draw and you could really draw in a really beautiful way. There were a number of fairly well drawn comic strips on the comics page in those days, and then there were a number of them that weren't quite so. And but yours stood out because it had a very contemporary feeling, as well as being a very kind of flowing, fluid feeling, which it maintained all the way through the strip.
It's funny that you would say it had a contemporary look, because what I was using was the old flexible nib pen that you used in the 30s, I guess.
Uh-huh,
People would write with these old metal flexible nib pens. And my mother was a calligrapher, actually. Her dad was a stamp collector and dealer in forgeries. So they had these incredible displays, and all of the history of the stamps had to be written by calligraphy in the day. And so my mother was a wonderful calligrapher, and she had all of these fine tipped pens, one of which was a C6 speedball pen, which I loved. When we started, I mean, it's not so long ago, but when I started school, we were using dip pens, and you'd have an inkwell in your desk. And of course, little kids are forever making use of that, right? But you did
sure.
learn to use a quill tip pen, which gives you that variable line, either a fine hair or else a big wide line. When I'm drawing, and I'm pretty sure other people feel the same way, especially if you're using something that widens when you press on it, is that you really breathe life into your characters with that line. You can push and pull on the line as if you were actually touching the character. So whenever I did the pencil line, I called it ghosting. And then when I drew the ink line over it, it was bringing the characters to life. And anytime I've ever done a workshop or worked with students at all, talking about the ghost line and then the lifeline that comes when you actually touch that character with the ink and make it permanent.
Oh, that's what brings it to life, absolutely. And it's the variation in that line, as you said, that really imbues the sense of the artist's touch, and also just the sense of vitality, because that flat straight line, just feels so dull and kind of dead. But when you bring that beautiful variation into the work, it really just sings, and that's great. So, do you still work with those kinds of pens? Do you still
I
work with a
do.
tip pen? You do.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Just
have
because
you?
I love the line, but
Uh,
because I'm 72, and that's a pain in the neck, because stuff stops working when you're older. All the stuff that you took for granted, everything from your voice to your balance to your vision to whatever, there's changes, and my hands shake now, which drives me crazy. And I also have a growth in my right eye, so my depth perception is out. And you say, damn body, damn.
yeah, yeah. Joseph Campbell used to say you have to identify with the mind and just let the body go.
Well,
I,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I
And
kind
don't
of
look in the
understand.
mirror. Don't look in the
Yeah.
mirror. But
I know.
so I'm finding that the dip pen for me is a little bit of a problem now, because my hand shakes. So I'm starting to use there's some wonderful products now, Stadler and some of these there's wonderful products from Japan and Germany that are coming out that give you a really solid black line that you can erase over, you can use whiteout over. It's light fast, all of that. And
Mhm.
I'm starting to use that more and more. And I use it on a tracing vellum, which is almost like a plastic. It's paper, but it's a
Mhm.
vellum. It's a drafting vellum. And I find that those pens, I draw in pencil on a piece of scrap, something, a cheap piece of paper. And then over top of that, I put this drafting vellum, so that
Mhm.
if I make a mistake, I can just either throw the vellum out, or I can white out. But my original drawing is always there. And I know that people who work on computers have all kinds of ways of fixing things, but I'm not a tablet person. I never will be now, because the learning curve is huge. But yeah, so I work on vellum now with a lot of these really nice felt tip pens.
Uh-huh. I've done that before, and so I'm familiar with the texture that vellum has when you put there's a nice flowing quality
Right,
that you get. Yeah, it's really nice the way the ink goes down and whatnot. And it holds, it doesn't bleed. And you would
right.
think that it would, and it doesn't, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that a lot of folks have done. I think I've seen some stuff by Bill Watterson and others who've used similar materials in the past. But I was going to ask you. You answered the question whether you've ever used the iPad or something like that. Simply because there is the Apple Pen, which I was always reluctant to try, but the Apple Pen has a great responsive quality to
Yeah.
it, which is kind of nice. It didn't have it for the longest time, but now it does. So now, at this point in your career, you're trying new things that actually you sort of tried a little bit when you had that time when you were in art school before you went out into the working world and took on a variety of different jobs. So it's kind of nice in a way to go back and resuscitate some of that interest in a variety of different mediums, and that must be very, very gratifying for you.
It is. It's quite different. When I was in art school, I took the advertising program, and it
Mm.
was a fine arts college, and we were called the hacks. And
Oof.
so anything that we did was considered, commercial. We were the only ones that made a living in the end. But typically in art school, your instructors, especially in advertising, might be 25 years out of date.
Mhm.
So color was just starting to come into the newspapers. Boy, I sound like
Oh.
a fossil, but color was just starting to come out in the newspapers, and only the front page was colored because it was so expensive, and it was often misregistered. So you'd get these halos of red and blue, and the initial printing colors it was hard for them to register these first page color printing systems.
Mhm.
But in art school, we were saying, why are we doing everything in black and white and gray and using frisket paper and all this antiquated stuff when everything is color now? And we were desperate for color. So many of us quit and went into the workforce without
Mm.
graduating from art school because they just didn't have what we needed. I mean, and you're wasting your time, right? So
Yeah.
I got a job in an animation studio and decided that was where I wanted to go. And this was in Vancouver, Canada. And the animation studio was farming stuff. They were bringing stuff in from Hanna-Barbera and some of the other Saturday morning shows. And there was no art school for animators, so you had to apprentice under just by working dog jobs in an animation studio, which is what I started to do. And
Mhm.
that just changed my life. I decided that was where I wanted to be, was in animation.
Ah. And that didn't quite work out, although there are animated versions of the comic strip. But
It
you didn't
yeah.
stay in animation long. Although I do understand that you did have at least some intermittent contact or brief contact with the J. Ward Studios, who did Bullwinkle.
That's right. Well, a friend of mine and I, she was from Los Angeles, and she and I were working together. She had moved to Vancouver, and was working in this studio with me. And the two of us were married to radio and TV guys who, the boss rock jocks type people.
Uh-huh.
And off we went to Los Angeles to visit her family, they wrote for Disney. And we just went down to visit, and she and I took our folios, and her mom and dad said, you guys have got to go in and do some searching around, because it looks like you'd be great to work in animation down here where it's really happening. So
Hmm.
we both of us were offered a job at J. Ward Studios. They wanted us to start right away in backgrounds, because we were both good artists and our background art was good and our storyboard art was good. But our husbands would not allow us to take the jobs because they would divorce us, right? Because
Uh,
they were in radio and TV guys in Los Angeles, I mean, Canadians, they're not going to hire Canadians when they have their own folk coming out of technical schools ready to take up a microphone or a camera, right? So sadly, we drove back to Canada with our husbands, the two of us in the back seat in tears that we couldn't work for
oh.
Super Chicken and George of the Jungle. Are you kidding me? Rocky and Bullwinkle. It was just heartbreaking for us.
Oh
So
yeah.
we came back to Canada, and then I ended up moving with my husband to Ontario, Canada, because there was more work in television for him. And that's when I got a job at McMaster University as a medical artist. I applied for the job. I saw an ad in the paper, And I spent all night drawing guts and skeletons and muscles and whatever I could draw from Gray's Anatomy and Grant's Anatomy. And I took my folio in and got the job, and they put me through first year medical school with a couple of other very good artists, and
Wow.
they trained us their own way. They didn't hire medical illustrators from Toronto because that's a very specialized job. They wanted people that they wanted to hire and train. So that's what I did. And for about 7 years, I worked as a medical illustrator or medical artist for McMaster University, and I used all my animation skills. It was very, very helpful.
Wow. How did animation skills come into play in doing medical research?
Well, there are things like the one thing that I remember particularly was a biopsy needle. And a biopsy needle is a strange split needle inside a tube. And when you put the tube, say, if you're doing a biopsy of a kidney, for example, you locate the position of the kidney and then you put the first tube in to touch the kidney, and the second tube is a split needle. And you have to push that down through the initial tube and it goes into the kidney. And then you take the first tube, push it over top, and then you pull the whole thing out, which gives you a little tiny worm of kidney in the second
Wow.
needle inside. But to try to explain that or to
Yeah.
even show somebody what it looks like, it's impossible. Even if you take someone into a clinic and do a biopsy on, say, a pig that's not alive, you can do all kinds of things, but it's a drawing that will absolutely clearly show somebody how this works. So I was able to animate a kidney biopsy, for example, but I did heart surgery and all kinds of. Hamilton was the burn capital of Canada because of the steel mills, and so there's all kinds of plastic surgical techniques that you really can't see in photographs because everything is red and yellow, and the tissue is
Right.
all different colors. So a drawing is so clear and so easy for a student to follow. They know exactly what they're looking at.
Oh my gosh, that's I'd never thought of that before, but obviously, yeah, you need clarity. And that kind of clarity in image making is going to play a role in comic strips later on, in your comic work later on, because you've got to be able to communicate clearly with relatively, simple drawings because they're going to be reduced so much. And that's fast.
What it really helped with was anatomy. Like, I know
Yeah.
my anatomy, I really do. And so I know I took a sculpture course at one time, and the sculptor had us begin with the skull, and then we added all the muscles on, and then we added the flesh on the outside, just to show you what the anatomy of the head was before you were actually going to try and do a portrait of somebody in clay. But I can do that in my head for the body because I had to work as a medical artist for so long, and so many illustrations of, skeletal structure and muscular, insertion, and it's just such a useful thing to have if you're going to be drawing bodies of any kind, whether it's animal or human. You really need to know what the body, what the skeleton and what the muscular system is like underneath that surface. So you really cannot draw that well. It's essential, unless of course you're drawing little uh, uh, cartoon that are really cartoons, like big heads and little bodies and things like that. Then you don't need that. But for me, I wanted it to be as realistic as possible, and I used the Archie cartoons. They were very
Hmm.
helpful. Not only were they beautifully drawn, but they would give you perspectives that were hard to draw, and things like, what does it look like when two people hold hands?
Right.
Unless you photograph two people holding hands from the back and the front, how do the fingers curl around one after the other, right?
Yeah.
And things and Archie was great for clothing. I mean, they would research the clothing of the day, and everybody's wearing up to date, especially Veronica and Betty. They're wearing the absolute fashion of the day, right? So
Oh,
I
yeah.
found that really helpful for resource material.
Oh yeah, and those were beautifully drawn comics, as you
Yeah.
said. There one artist who always stands out to me is Harry Lucy. I don't know if you know his name, but he was he's one of those guys you saw in Archie comics. Identified him and said that's the good artist. He's
Yeah.
really great. But Dan DeCarlo, I mean, both of
Right.
them were just
Yeah.
fabulous. And I think what happens when you're looking at those comics is folks just sort of take them for granted. They're beautifully produced, They're consistent, and they have all these wonderful qualities that we just sort of get used to and accept as being mass produced, and we don't think about the people behind them. But they were masters, and
They were.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Because there's a cartoony quality, but there's also a natural quality. Now I think, I haven't read Archie in a while, but I think they're going for a much more, much different, much more like almost not naturalistic, but almost hyper superhero style.
Uh,
It's a little different, but I prefer
well,
those
you
guys.
you want something that the audience can live up to. I mean, I never liked superhero characters because for me they weren't believable, and especially the women were always these Barbie doll looking characters, and at first it was save me, Superman
Oh
save me, and I thought, oh, save yourself, you wimp. And I just couldn't identify with all these perfect people, but I loved little Lulu and Dottie, and I didn't like Nancy as a strip, but I loved those sloppy rounded characters because that was me, that was something I could identify with. So I like realistic. I like stuff that is possible.
yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. And well, and that's one of the underlying qualities for better or for worse that runs through the entire strip. And this is, I think, one of the I don't want to leave aside everything about your career trajectory yet, but I do want to comment on this. One of the wonderful things about that strip that I think is a minor miracle of a kind is that it's both you found a way of weaving in everyday life, everyday occurrences that feel very much a part of our lives as readers, and things that we are familiar with and we experience in one form or another. And yet you found the gentle humor in all of it. And I mean, some of it's very touching, some of it's, filled with pathos and brings tears to our eyes, but then other parts of it are just, you find the humor in all of it, and every day it makes you want to read the next strip and the next strip and the next strip. And there's just this wonderful balancing act that happens within For Better or For Worse that I think is really rare. And because it is so seamless, it's easy, again, like Archie comics, it's easy to take for granted because you do it so well.
Well, thank you. Gee, I'm floating here.
Well, I have to tell you, when I read For Better or For Worse, I really and in preparation to talk for you, I went back and read a lot of stuff, and I have to say, it both makes me laugh and also almost brings me to tears while I'm reading it. Even the strips that are not necessarily sad, because it reminds me so much of things or feelings in general that happen in my own family, in my own life, and I think that readers all over the place have the same kind of relationship with the comic strip, and I think that's just like I said, it's a miracle of a kind to be able to put all of these tendencies together, come up with a strip that really reads as so universal.
Well, it's kind of like Seinfeld, where it was a strip about nothing, right? The
Mm.
Seinfeld was a show about nothing, and really everybody connected so gloriously with Seinfeld. For example, something like people who talk too slowly. I mean, just little things like that are things that you talk about with your friends over a beer, right? Oh, that person drives me crazy because they're always saying. Well, that could become a whole show in Seinfeld.
Oh yeah.
So, but it's something we all identify with. And I guess whenever I did a strip that was a little personal or a little goofy, I knew somebody out there would have had that happen to them. And one that comes to mind is John Patterson in the comic strip drops a frozen turkey on his foot and he breaks his foot. And
Mhm.
in the illustration that shows him actually dropping the turkey on his foot, because I went to buy one of these big 20-pound turkeys one time, and as I picked it up out of the freezer with one of those little plastic handles, I thought, if this handle breaks and it falls
Yeah.
on my foot, I kill myself here. So I did the strip knowing that somebody out there would have had this happen. And as soon as the strip ran, I got a letter from a guy who said, I did that. I dropped a frozen turkey on my foot, and he said, I couldn't get any sympathy because it was funny. Everybody'd laugh. And he said, I was in terrible pain. So I sent him the strip. That was my plan. The first person who called me, who wrote to me that said they dropped a turkey on their foot, would get that original strip. And I had a nice dialogue with the guy afterwards. It
Oh,
connected to me all kinds of people.
Yeah, and it's funny because you mentioned something like that because the we have a couple of dogs, and the dogs are driving my wife and I crazy because they want to go in and out all the time, particularly when we're in this one room where there's a door, sliding glass door, and they want to go in and out all the time. And I just read the strip the other day where Eddie and Dixie want to go in and out all the
Right.
time, in
Yes.
and out, in and out, in and out, and it's just like it was perfect because it's exactly the experience that we were having, and for better or for worse does that so well. It picks up on you know so many of these little moments as well as the big ones.
I no longer have a pet
Ah, really? Okay.
because of these moments.
Well, yeah, and I can understand that, at a certain
Yeah,
point, it gets cumbersome to be
yeah, they
caring.
were owning me.
Yeah, and exactly. They will do that. They train you the way they want you to be trained, and then exactly. Well. But so getting back to your career then, now it's interesting, the road to syndication for you was really pretty unique in a way. I mean, it grew out of visits to your obstetrician.
Oh, yeah, there was nothing on the ceiling above the examining table. So he was one of the people that I did cartoons for. His name was Murray Ankin, and he was the pioneer in Canada for natural childbirth, for family childbirth, where the husband and children could come in and watch. And it was a whole new method. He really believed that midwives should be part of this. And so he had me do a whole lot of cartoons about childbirth and all the different exercises you take for the Lamaze and La Boya methods of childbirth, things like that. So after seeing him as a physician and saying, better put something over the ceiling, on the ceiling over the examining tables, he said, well, you're the cartoonist. I challenge you to do some cartoons. So after my son was born, there were about 80 cartoons. And shortly after that, my husband left with a voluptuous script assistant, and
Mm.
I was on my own with a baby boy. So I was thinking the world had come to an end, and I was freelancing as a medical artist for McMaster and doing odd jobs and working I'd started a little graphic art studio in my house, and I was doing quite well, actually. I had clients. The trouble with your own business is that often people don't pay you. And you're
Oh
desperate
yeah.
for that $30 that's coming from Nova Scotia, and the doggone magazine won't pay you. And anyway, so when I got a call from my doctor to come over and have dinner, I was shocked. I mean, who gets an invitation from their obstetrician to go to their house for dinner? So when I got to the house, his wife opened the door, and there he was sitting in the middle of his living room with a bottle of champagne and all my cartoons around him in the order that I had done them. And he said, "Kid, you got a book." And he popped open the champagne, and he helped me get a publisher. And that first little book sold very well. So I did two more, all on raising little kids. And I thought, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do freelance advertising, and I'll do a book a year, and that'll be me.
Hmm.
And I ended up getting a publisher in Minneapolis who sent the books to the Universal Press Syndicate with a note saying, if you don't syndicate her, I will.
Wow.
And I got a 20-year contract from Universal Press.
On the basis of those books.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. What a story that is. And actually you had some trouble getting paid for the books, didn't you?
Oh gosh, yes. The first I mean, you go from publisher to publisher if you're doing these little, press runs. And the first publisher was being funded by the Canada Council, and
Mm.
he got money from the Canada Council and put a pool in his backyard. And yeah, and after a number of years, he owed me $20,000 for that first book. And rather than go to all the trouble of going to court and all of that stuff, I just got the rights of the book back for that $20,000. It was, you really do, as an artist, especially as a young unknown artist, and as musicians and singers and dancers and artists of all kinds, you get taken advantage of because it's a skill that people think, oh well, it comes to you for free, so it should come to me for free. But you're not going to not pay your electrician, or you're not going to not pay your drywaller, but
Yeah.
don't pay the artists. It comes to them for free.
Yeah,
So
right.
it's a subsistence living at the best. And I was very lucky to get this contract with Universal Press. And in the end, it was a good company to work for. It was a great company to work for. I'm very, very lucky. I got into it at a time when comics were still a big deal in the newspaper, and the newspapers were solid. And yeah, I was very lucky to get the job when I did.
Well, now the books that came out originally with those cartoons about pregnancy and about raising toddlers and whatnot. I mean, I'm not sure that folks, particularly younger people, will be aware, but there was a period of time when, just the word pregnant was something that people didn't say out loud in front of
No,
a variety of other people. There were, on television, Robin and Laura Petrie slept in different
separate beds.
beds, separate
I know.
beds, and
Yeah,
nobody talked about where little Richie came from. And,
right.
I mean, all of that was disguised, and there was this kind of veneer or cloak, this invisibility cloak, over
Yes.
the whole process. And so when you were doing that, it was really, I mean, really unique to find comic material about what a woman goes through when she's pregnant, and what
Yeah.
happens in her life, and particularly from a woman's point of view as well.
There was a series of little books that came out, I think, from Britain, and it was called Egbert and Egberta. And it was showing a baby in the womb and all the thoughts that a baby has. And it was considered really, really a serious breach. Breach. That's a funny word for this, but it was considered bad form. And anybody that owned these little books sort of kept them under a brown paper wrapper. And all it was a little baby in a shape that looked like a balloon around it. And he was thinking, and one I can remember was this little baby is squeezed and he's saying, "Mom's wearing a girdle again," and things like that. And there's another one where the baby is looking through the opening of the balloon saying, "Peekaboo, I see you," as if they're, the doctor is looking at during birth or
Uh-huh.
something. And it was considered a very, very bad taste, this Egbert and Egberta. But I had seen those books and thought they were kind of cool. And I guess I'd been, in my teens or something when the kids would pass them around, like, "Hey, did you see what I found?"
But your books were very different in the sense that they were about the experiences you were having and the experiences other women were having at those times. I mean, it was from your point of view instead of from, the child's point of view.
Absolutely. And I tried to show all kinds of different people, different backgrounds, different types of people, and with their different attitudes. Some people really looking forward to getting pregnant and excited
Mhm.
about it. Some people are shocked and weren't expecting it. Some people are expecting twins and aren't prepared. And so I tried to show all different ethnicities and different age groups and different situations so that it wasn't just one character and one person's experience. That was because I was still working as a medical artist, and I was still working for Dr. Enkin and doing all kinds of drawings for him.
And you were seeing folks with all kinds of different backgrounds and all kinds
Right,
of different experiences. Yeah.
right.
So your observations, it's really interesting how that career in the hospital really sort of, I mean, it's interesting as it's not the path you would normally think would lead to syndication, but in a way, if you hadn't worked in the hospital and you hadn't had the obstetrician you did, you may not have ended up with a syndication contract. You may have ended up doing something entirely different. Graphic studio might have taken off and
Yeah.
whatever. But it's kind of interesting that pathway that led you to the place that you needed to be.
Well, I think everybody's got a story. Everybody has a story. There's always somebody who gives you a hand or offers advice or opens a door for you. And yeah, I've had some wonderful, wonderful people in my life who've helped me not only have the courage to do something, but once I got into it, to steer me along.
And that's what happened once you got picked up by Universal and Lee Salem, and the
Right.
folks there started to work with you on a regular basis, help you put the strip together and formulate the strip. How did that process go? I mean, you're sort of thrown into it.
Well, for the first 6 months, I asked if I could just practice because, some people who really want a career in syndicated comics, they work for a long time, sometimes a lifetime, perfecting their characters and storylines and ideas, and they submit something that's already got a form to it. But I had nothing. I just had my own family that I could maybe draw if I was lucky, over and over again. And so I asked for this 6 months just development period. So I had a development contract and I worked with Lee. And this was really before computers. So you did everything on fax. Fax machine was an absolutely wonderful invention at the time. So I could send my pencil sketches to Lee by fax, and he would call me and we'd go over everything on the phone. And that was wonderful. I appreciated that so much. So after a while, I was confident that I could begin. And then, it's like a raft going down the Colorado River. No paddles. You just hope to make it to the other end because you're not getting out. You're not getting off. There's no place to stop.
You had a 20-year contract, so there was no way. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what kinds of things did Lee suggest about the strip and the characters and gags and whatnot?
Legibility, subject matter, economy of words. You need to write almost as if you're a poet so that your reader doesn't get hung up on words that are not necessarily suitable. You want to be able to get from the first panel to the end as easily and as smoothly as possible without stopping anywhere to say, wait a minute, I'm confused. And so it's a writing style, and it really is almost like poetry, so that the words flow from beginning to end and that your gag line is well timed. It's timing as well. And Lee was an extremely good editor, so I really enjoyed his help. And of course, he would tell me what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable. There are times when you think something's funny and nobody else does. And one of my very best editors was my mother-in-law, who never even got an elephant joke. And if she didn't get an idea, and I was, look, it's obvious. See, look, this is what happened. And there's a punchline. And she would say, yeah, but, and I knew that, well, there's a huge percent of my readership that isn't going to get it. So Ruth was my best editor. I would take all my stuff to her first.
And I mean, was that mostly in the early days, or did that last throughout, your tenure on the strip, or I mean,
as long as she was alive, as long as Ruth was alive, she was one of my best editors. Because really, if somebody looks at something and says, I don't get it, you really have to look at it again yourself and say, yeah, if you don't get it, then others aren't going to get it either. I mean, there's a huge ego involved in something like this. If you get that job, your ego is just flat out fat, right?
Yeah.
And so you think that you know it all, and that whatever you do, other people should get it because you're so clever. But often cleverness is not enough. You have to be very clear, very obvious in what you're doing.
What's really astonishing is that you were coming from an art background primarily, and I mean, you'd grown up as an artist, and all of a sudden now you're in this field where writing is like 90% of what makes a successful cartoonist or syndicated cartoon.
Yeah, you don't have the writing, you don't have the art.
Right, and the writing is really what carries it along, because a variety of art styles can work within the world of comics, and yet and it's always lovely to see beautiful art and whatnot, but if the writing's not there, then it falls flat. And the writing was really, as you developed, the writing became more and more complex, more and more multi-layered,
Yeah, it's a skill that you really do have to, it takes a while to learn. And once you're there, it's really rewarding because you can edit yourself. And you do know if something's going to work or if something is not going to work.
Well, and how as you were developing as a writer, you were going from this fairly small nuclear family to a multi-family epic in a way. And, how did you develop the skills? Was it just sort of a gradual growth, or because it went from being a strip that was really about Ellie and the children and John, and then everybody's growing up and it becomes their friends, and it becomes more and more complex as time goes on, and then multi-generational. It's really quite extraordinary. That must have been a challenge.
It had to happen because I get bored very quickly with things that aren't moving along, and so anytime I introduced a new character or changed the ages of the character, it added more of of a challenge to me, which added more interest to me. And I figured if I'm bored with this, everybody else is going to be bored with this. So I might really have added too many characters. But if you think about your own life and your own family and all of the auxiliary friends and neighbors and teachers and, the guy that, sells you your groceries. I mean, really, there are so many. Each one of us has literally thousands of connections, if you think about it. And so by the time I ended the strip, I had well over 100 characters that were there, whether it was friends, teachers, even the bus driver, there were all these different characters, which I had to learn how to draw and have a voice for. So it's an acting job as well.
Where were the inspirations for these characters? Were they people who you encountered in life?
Sure.
Or?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. In fact, I think you really do need to imagine a certain individual if you're doing a character, whether you're acting or drawing a character. You really do need to think about somebody who would have that body language or that style of speech. And the one character that really comes to mind is Aunt Fiona, who showed up after April. The character April is born, and she comes ostensibly to help, but she turns out to be the biggest nuisance in the world. Well, she was based on my Aunt Margaret, who owned a pool hall, she was an alcoholic. She was funny. And she kept a shotgun in her bathroom in case her ex-husband ever showed up again.
Oh my gosh.
Honest to God. And I said to her, so Margaret, I says, the bathroom's so small, you can't get the damn thing up to your shoulder properly. She says, I don't care, honey. She says, if he shows up, I'll shoot him in the head or I'll shoot him in the nuts. I don't care, one way or the other. He's going down, right? A shotgun in the bathroom. Funny. And it was a pool hall, and I loved the pool hall. And it had a really seedy, dirty little kitchen, and she made hot dogs and burgers and fries for her customers, and all the queues were bent. Holy smokes, what a place. And I was hoping that I could really show the pool hall, but she was too wonderful a character, and it would have just taken the strip away in another direction. So I had to just allude to the fact that she had a pool hall, and that was it. So yeah, eventually there was too much material. It went on and on and on.
Well, yeah, and that could have been a strip unto itself. I mean,
it would have been great. Fiona, it would have been great because I had Margaret to think about, and Margaret was a hoot. She was an absolute hoot.
Oh my gosh. Well, so were there any storylines at that point that were outright rejected by the syndicate?
There were a couple of situations that we didn't do because they were going to be either too close to home or kind of depressing, and I didn't want to do depressing stuff. And some things are unresolvable, and so the character next door, Annie, her husband was a hoarder and he was a womanizer, and she knew that he was unfaithful to her, and it was a big problem for her. But I never got into that story, although it was very clear in my mind. But I never got into it, and that was partly from talking to Lee and partly from just on my own thinking that just might not be a great idea.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes you can open up a door, and that door can lead you down, a path that just doesn't feel right somehow or another. And
yeah. So that's the case. Yeah.
And there you have it, the end of part 1 of our interview with Lynn Johnston. That's right. Don't be worried. Don't be upset. I know it ended and you're like, oh, I want more. Yes, there is more coming at you next week. Part 2 of our interview with the great Lynn Johnston of For Better or For Worse. So be sure to come back. Be sure to look for it on your feed. Part 2 is even better than this episode. So I can't believe anything could get better than this episode, but it does. So check in with me again here on the podcast next week. All right. Part 2 of Lynn Johnston. And boy, we've got some great stuff coming up. We've got Terry Flippo of Deliver Me, and we've got Kevin Much of the anticipated new release from Fantagraphics called The Rough Pearl, and I'll be talking to both Terry and Kevin very shortly, so I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you are too. Hope you have gone over to my Patreon page. If you haven't, shame on you. Go to patreon.com/Geoff Grogan, GeoffGrogan. There's lots of goodies there for anybody who chooses to support the podcast. You will also have my deep appreciation if you do so. It goes a long way to helping the longevity of the podcast and improving my life and creative life in general. So check it out, patreon.com/Geoff Grogan. And it's a good trade-off, there's some good stuff there for you too, and any support is greatly appreciated. What else do I have to tell you? I know there was something. Oh, hey, be sure to go to my Instagram feed @GroganGeoff, GroganGeoff, if you haven't heard enough already. Go to my Instagram feed. I've got a little promo for this piece. If you don't follow me there, you don't get to see these little things. I've done a little special animation in honor of Lynn Johnston being on the show. Hope you'll check it out. There's also other little bits of animation. They will be showing up on my YouTube channel also, if that's easier for you, on YouTube, Geoff Grogan's Blockhead. So look for that, okay? I'm going to be putting up all of my stuff up there, and I might even actually try to consistently make sure some of these podcast episodes get up there to stay as well. I'd love for you to see that little animation bit. It was a lot of fun to put together. So until next time, I think that does it for me. Wow, I've taxed my imagination. It's time to go. Okay, I'll see you next week. Okay, till then, thanks for listening.